I found a hidden room in my basement. I wish I had. The secret door. John had always dreamed of owning an old house. So when the opportunity to buy the dilapidated, century-old property at a bargain price arose, he couldn't resist. The house had character, creaking floorboards, a dusty attic, and an almost oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air. It felt like a place filled with stories waiting to be uncovered. But over the past few weeks, strange things had started to happen. It began with the noises. Late at night, when everything should have been still, John would hear faint scraping sounds from the basement. At first, he shrugged them off as the house settling. After all, it was an old structure. But the sounds didn't stop. They grew more frequent, more persistent, like something or someone was moving around in the dark. One evening, unable to shake his curiosity, John decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and descended the wooden stairs into the basement, the air growing cooler with each step. The place was filled with boxes of old furniture and stacks of forgotten memories. Dust motes swirled in the weak beam of his flashlight, dancing like tiny ghosts. He scanned the room, listening, straining to hear any movement. His attention was drawn to a large stack of old furniture against the far wall. As he moved closer, he felt an unsettling chill in the air. Something about the stack seemed off, as though it was too neatly piled, too intentional. The scratching sound came again, faint but undeniable. He felt his heartbeat quicken. Pushing aside a few dusty chairs and old lamps, he uncovered something strange, a door hidden behind the clutter. It was small, almost unnoticeable at first, but the edges of the wood were faintly visible. His heart skipped a beat. A door. Here, in the basement. He didn't remember ever seeing it before. With trembling hands, John reached for the rusted handle. The door creaked open with an eerie, almost mocking sound, revealing a dark, forgotten room. He shined his flashlight inside, revealing walls covered in strange, cryptic symbols that looked almost like they had been scratched into the wood by something sharp. The room was filled with old, decaying furniture, chairs with broken legs, a dusty table, and a small, ominous chest in the center of the room. John hesitated. The air felt heavy here, thick with the scent of mildew and something darker. But his curiosity got the better of him. He approached the chest. It was worn but sturdy, the lock rusted with age. He knelt down, and with a sharp tug, the lid creaked open. Inside, he found a collection of old photographs, black and white images of people he didn't recognize. A family, perhaps, but their faces were all strangely familiar. As he flipped through the photos, one particular image caught his eye. It was a group photo, a family standing together, smiling in front of a house that looked eerily like his own. But there, among the people, was one man who looked strikingly like him. The same hair, the same eyes, the same expression. John's blood ran cold. He stared at the photograph, his mind racing. What was the connection? Why did these people, these strangers, look so much like him? He felt as though the walls of the room were closing in, suffocating him with a terrible realization. This hidden room wasn't just a forgotten part of the house. It was a part of his family's history. a history he had never known. As he stood there, frozen in place, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had uncovered something that was never meant to be found. The room, the chest, the photographs, everything felt wrong, as though it had all been waiting for him to discover it. And now that he had, there was no turning back. The door behind him creaked softly, as if beckoning him to leave. But John remained motionless, staring at the photographs in his hand, knowing deep down that this was only the beginning of something much darker than he could have ever imagined. The old journal. Clara had been living in the old house for only a few weeks, but already it felt like it was beginning to reveal its dark secrets. The basement, which she had initially thought was nothing more than a musty storage area, held a hidden room. The moment she found the secret door behind the wall of forgotten furniture, she knew she had uncovered something that was never meant to be discovered. Her heart raced as she stood in the forgotten room, bathed in the flickering light of her flashlight. The walls were covered with strange, unsettling symbols, scrawled hastily, almost as though they were the remnants of a long-forgotten ritual. But what intrigued her the most was the large wooden table in the center of the room. A layer of dust coated everything, but there, right on the table, was an object that shouldn't have been there, an old leather-bound journal. With hesitant fingers, Clara reached for the journal, its edges worn and cracked from years of neglect. She wiped away the dust, careful not to damage it, and opened the first page. Immediately, she saw strange, looping handwriting, accompanied by illustrations that seemed to depict the very room she was standing in. One sketch showed the symbols on the walls, another the table, and a third, an eerie image of a figure standing in a corner, obscured by shadow. The entries were dated back to the early 1900s, and Clara's curiosity deepened with every page she turned. The journal's author described the room in vivid detail, recounting how it had been used for dark rituals meant to summon or bind an unknown entity. The further she read, the more unsettling the details became. The figure that appeared in the sketches wasn't just a drawing. It was real, and it had been bound to the room for reasons the journal's author never fully explained. The writer spoke of whispers in the night, of footsteps echoing through the walls, of an unsettling presence that never seemed to leave. Clara shuddered as she read the words, feeling an oppressive weight in the room. She had to keep reading. There was a part of her, a deep, nagging curiosity, that pushed her to understand more. As the sun set outside, casting long, eerie shadows across the basement, the air grew colder. The faint rustling of the pages was the only sound in the room. Clara didn't hear the footsteps at first. They were faint, like a distant echo. But then they grew louder, closer, until it felt as though someone was walking just behind her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was no one there. Only the shadows of forgotten memories seemed to cling to the corners of the room. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled around her, growing louder with each passing second. And then, from the corner of the room, she heard it, a whisper. The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to hear. The whisper came again, this time closer. "Leave, leave now." The words were cold, and they seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Clara's hand trembled as she clutched the journal tighter. She turned back to the page she had been reading, but the words on the page were no longer clear. The handwriting had started to shift, becoming more erratic and frantic. And then, at the bottom of the page, the final words were written in an unfamiliar, jagged script. "He's coming for you." Clara slammed the journal shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stood frozen, listening. The footsteps were no longer faint. They were right behind her now. The air felt thick, suffocating, and she could feel an overwhelming presence closing in on her. Suddenly, the door to the hidden room slammed shut with a deafening bang. Clara spun around, her eyes wide with terror, but the room was empty. The footsteps had stopped. The whispers faded into silence. She was alone, but the cold air that filled the room felt like a warning. Clara knew, deep down, that the figure from the journal, the one bound to the room, wasn't just a relic of the past. It was still there, and it was waiting for her to uncover more. Clara backed away from the table, heart racing. She had stumbled upon something far darker than she ever could have imagined. And now there was no turning back. The unseen presence. The Thompson family had always dreamed of transforming their aging Victorian house into a cozy, modern home. After years of neglect, they finally decided to tackle the long overdue renovations, starting with the basement. It was the perfect project to begin with, spacious and full of potential. The family, eager to bring new life to the house, quickly got to work, pulling out old furniture and boxes, dusting off forgotten relics of the past. As they dug through piles of old clothes and broken antiques, a hidden feature of the basement caught their attention. A faint outline of brick that had been sealed up long ago. Curious, they pried away the debris and began carefully chipping at the old brick wall. After hours of work, the final brick fell, revealing an entirely new room behind it. At first, it looked like any forgotten storage room, but as they ventured inside, a shiver of unease ran down their spines. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew and decay lingered in the stagnant air. Old furniture, chairs, tables, and faded rugs were scattered about, some broken, some covered in layers of grime. There were faded paintings hanging crookedly on the walls, depicting scenes of a time long past. Yet what unsettled them the most was the feeling that everything in the room was out of place, as though the room had been frozen in time. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, they continued exploring, driven by curiosity. The family, parents Mark and Susan, and their two kids, Lily and Jake, moved from one object to the next. A cracked mirror leaned against the far wall, its reflective surface distorted and murky. The chair, once finely crafted, had been abandoned at the center of the room, the wood warped and brittle with age. But as they delved deeper into the room, strange things started to happen. The lights overhead began to flicker, casting long, twitching shadows across the room. At first, they assumed it was a faulty connection, but then the shadows in the corners seemed to shift, moving ever so slightly, as though something was lurking just beyond the edge of their vision. Mark reached for the light switch, but the flickering continued, more erratic now, as if something was interfering with the power. Susan took a step forward, and she froze, her eyes wide with panic. In the reflection of the cracked mirror, she swore she saw a shadow move, only there was no one behind her. The air grew inexplicably colder, a chill creeping into her bones. "Did you hear that?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. Everyone stopped, straining to listen. At first, there was only the quiet hum of the flickering lights. But then came a faint scraping noise, followed by a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to come from all around them. "Okay, this is getting weird," Mark said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Let's get out of here." But as they turned to leave, they found the door had slammed shut behind them, the cold wooden frame now completely solid. The lock had engaged itself from the inside, and no matter how hard they pulled, it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. "What's going on?" Susan's voice shook as she tried the door again, her hands trembling with fear. How did it lock? Lily, her eyes wide with fright, backed away from the door. "Mom, I don't like it here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's like something's watching us." The family stood frozen for a moment, the silence hanging heavy in the air. And then, once again, they heard the scraping sound, closer this time. It was as though something or someone was moving inside the walls, shifting just beyond their sight. Mark slammed his shoulder into the door, trying to break it open, but it was no use. The door was as immovable as the thick silence that surrounded them. They were trapped. It was then that they noticed something chilling. On the far side of the room, the paintings seemed to be shifting ever so slightly, as if the figures in the portraits were slowly changing positions. The eyes of the people in the paintings, which had once seemed static, now followed their every movement, and the air grew heavier, as though the room itself was breathing, expanding and contracting with every passing second. Susan stumbled backward, her hand brushing against the table. She felt something strange beneath her fingers, cold, sticky. Looking down, she saw a dark substance slowly oozing from the cracks in the table, as though it had been trapped there for decades. Mark finally let out a curse. "We need to get out of here now." But as they gathered their strength to try again, something darker seemed to stir in the room. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, and a figure appeared in the corner of the room. For a split second, it was a shadow, flickering like a candle in the wind, but then it solidified, a figure tall and thin, with hollow eyes that stared into the family's very souls. Frozen in terror, they watched as the figure raised a hand, and in that instant, the whispers stopped. The lights flickered one final time, and the room seemed to close in around them. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The door creaked open on its own, and they rushed out, slamming it shut behind them. As they ascended the basement stairs, none of them looked back. But as they reached the top, Susan glanced at the basement door and felt a chill creep down her spine. They might have left the room, but the room had not left them. Something had followed them, and it would not be ignored. The Watcher's eyes. Jason had always been a practical man, preferring to handle problems around the house himself. So when the pipe in his basement started leaking, he didn't think twice about heading down to fix it. The basement was dimly lit, the faint hum of the water heater echoing off the walls as he made his way past boxes of forgotten clutter and old furniture. The air was thick with dust, and every creak of the floorboards seemed to send a shiver up his spine. The leak was worse than he expected, and as he knelt to examine the pipes, his eyes caught something unusual in the corner of the room. He had never noticed it before, a narrow doorway hidden behind a stack of old crates. It was barely noticeable, but the dim light from his flashlight revealed it clearly. Jason's curiosity got the best of him, and after moving the crates aside, he pushed open the door. It creaked as it swung open, revealing a small hidden room. Inside, the air was stale, and the room felt unnervingly cold. The walls were lined with large, ornate mirrors, some leaning against the walls and others hanging in strange positions. Dust coated every surface, giving the room an abandoned, forgotten feel. But something about it felt wrong. The mirrors weren't ordinary. They were cracked, warped, and discolored. Jason felt an uneasy sense of being watched as he stepped further into the room, his flashlight beam sweeping over the glass. He walked closer to one of the mirrors, inspecting the cracks that spidered across its surface. The reflection was distorted, like looking through a dirty window. But one mirror at the far end of the room caught his attention. Unlike the others, this one was perfectly smooth, the glass almost too clean, as if it had been polished recently. But as he moved closer, he felt an unsettling coldness radiating from it, a sense of foreboding he couldn't explain. Jason stood in front of the mirror, studying his own reflection, when something caught his eye. There, just behind him, in the reflection, was a figure, a shadowy, indistinct shape. His heart raced. He whipped around, but the room was empty. He looked back at the mirror, but the figure was still there, standing just behind him, staring at him with hollow, empty eyes. Panic surged through him. He stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. It couldn't be real, could it? But when he turned back to the mirror, the figure was still there, closer now, its shape becoming clearer. Jason tried to look away, but his gaze was locked. The figure moved ever so slightly, as if it were waiting for him to do something. The room seemed to close in around him. Jason felt a tightening in his chest. The air grew thick, suffocating. He reached for the door, desperate to leave, but when he tried to step back, the space behind him felt smaller, the walls pressing in closer. The mirrors seemed to distort, the reflections warping in unnatural ways. His hands trembled as he pulled at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though the room had changed, trapping him in its claustrophobic grip. His mind raced, but no matter how much he struggled, the feeling of being watched only intensified. The mirrors seemed to shift, their reflections becoming more and more unsettling. As Jason turned to face the door again, he caught sight of another figure. This one was behind him in the mirror, a faint outline in the background, but it wasn't his reflection. It was a figure, standing still and motionless, its dark eyes staring directly at him. Suddenly, Jason's heart stopped. He wasn't alone in the room anymore. Frantically, he reached for his flashlight, but as he turned it toward the figure in the mirror, it vanished, only to be replaced by his own reflection. He spun around again, but the room was empty. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to calm his racing mind, but the sense of being watched only grew stronger. The room itself seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and he could feel something moving just beyond his reach, an invisible presence closing in on him. Desperate to escape, Jason sprinted toward the door once more, his hand shaking as he twisted the knob. But it remained locked, the door now sealed tight. The mirrors on the walls began to distort further, their surfaces rippling like water, as though they were alive. Jason stumbled back in horror, his heart racing as he realized the truth. He was trapped in this room, surrounded by eyes that weren't his own. The figure in the mirror was closer now. He could see its face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that never blinked. It smiled at him, its mouth twisting into a sinister grin. Jason's breath hitched in his throat as he realized that the figure was no longer confined to the reflection. It was in the room with him, its presence suffocating, pulling him deeper into the madness. Just as he thought he might lose his sanity, the mirror seemed to flicker, the figure vanishing once again. The door suddenly creaked open, and Jason stumbled out of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back as he rushed up the stairs. The image of those hollow eyes seared into his mind. But as he glanced back at the basement door, he couldn't shake the feeling that the watcher was still there, waiting for him to return. The face in the closet. Emily had reached her breaking point. The constant feeling of being watched, the creeping fear that haunted her every step, she couldn't take it anymore. She needed to leave, to escape, to put miles between herself and whatever it was that had made her apartment feel like a prison. The decision was made. She packed her things hastily, throwing clothes into a suitcase, her hands shaking as she zipped it up. Her apartment felt colder now, emptier. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the silence echoed in her ears like a warning. She moved quickly, her mind set on the road ahead, on freedom. All she had to do was grab a few final things from the closet. Then she would be out of here. She opened the door and reached for her suitcase, her fingers brushing against the cool fabric of her coats. But then, as she pulled the suitcase from the shelf, something hit her, foul, overwhelming odor, something rotten and rancid. Emily froze. The smell was so thick, so suffocating, that it made her stomach churn. She instinctively stepped back, the suitcase half pulled from the closet. Her eyes darted around the small, dimly lit space, her breath quickening. She had never noticed the smell before, and it made her skin crawl. It was as though something had been festering here for weeks. As her gaze traveled downward, something caught her eye, something wedged between her coats. At first, she thought it was just a pile of old clothes, but then she realized it was too neat, too deliberate. A crumpled hoodie, a pair of worn-out shoes, and beneath it all a small, thin mattress. Her heart began to race, her breath shallow as she took a step closer, the smell growing worse with every movement. She pushed the coats aside with trembling hands, her mind struggling to make sense of the horrifying sight before her. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been living here, in her closet. Her pulse quickened as she leaned down, her stomach twisting in knots. The mattress was stained, the fabric torn in places, and there were crumbs scattered across the floor. A half-empty water bottle sat nearby, a forgotten piece of someone's life. Emily stumbled back, gasping for air as the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Someone had been hiding in her apartment, right under her nose. She spun around to grab her phone from the counter, her hand shaking as she unlocked it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she quickly checked the time, 3 a.m. It was too late. There was no one else in the apartment. And yet, just as she started to dial the police, a sudden vibration from her phone made her freeze. Text from an unknown number. "You were never supposed to find me." The word sent a shockwave of terror through her entire body. Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen, the blood draining from her face. It wasn't just the message, it was the chilling, ominous nature of it. Whoever had been hiding in her closet had known she would eventually find them. They had been waiting for this moment. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked back at the closet, her eyes scanning the dimly lit space. It was empty now, just the coats, the shoes, the mattress. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, watching her the entire time. She stepped back toward the door, her heart pounding louder with each step. The apartment that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a tomb. She could feel it. That oppressive, lingering presence. It was still there somewhere, waiting. Emily slammed the closet door shut, the finality of the action sending a wave of cold dread through her. But she knew she couldn't stay here any longer. Not after what she had found. Without a second thought, she grabbed her suitcase and rushed for the door. The text message still burned in her mind, the words echoing in her ears. "You were never supposed to find me." Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't dare to check it. She was already out the door, her feet carrying her away from the nightmare that had been her life for the past few weeks. The door clicked shut behind her, but in her mind, she could still hear it, the soft creak of the closet door, the faint rustling of something hidden just out of sight.